Volumetric lighting is something that in the real world is basically just a natural phenomenon that occurs more on sort of misty, foggy days. But then again, it's always there. Whenever you see light passing through our atmosphere, there's some sort of distortion going on. Now in 3D, we need some sort of tricks to generate a similar effect. So in this scene here in Blender, you can see I added in this ginormous volumetric cube with a volumetric material, which is basically, you know, a very simple material with no surface material shader, but a volume shader. And this sort of cube catches the light and creates the effect. So in here with our volume, if we disable it, we create this hazy effect. And it's also the way that we sort of start creating some of these God rays. So I believe this is a bit strong here, but you can start seeing that we create some volumetric God rays whenever we're looking at this part here. Now, volumes are quite heavy to render. So I would always say only use them whenever you really need them. Let's go into how to set it up. So in a new file here, it's actually really quite simple to do. Now, in the previous file, what I did is I basically took a cube. Let's create a very simple scene here. We have the monkey, we have the plane, we're going to align that to the bottom, and we have a cube, which we're going to use to cover our entire scene. So we're just going to scale that up until it sort of covers the entire thing. In our object properties, let's just make sure it's not in the way. So we're going to go viewport display, and we're going to change that to wire. And there we go. Let's add in a material for our cube here. We can remove our surface material because we don't actually need that. And inside of the volume tab here, we can simply add a volume scatter, for example. And there we go. We now have a volumetric cube inside of our scene. We can change the density to be whatever. And because of the point light in our scene, we immediately get some volumetric lighting. So we get a nice hazy lighting that is sort of affecting our scene here. Now, whenever we're working with the volumes, there's two sort of sliders that you can change. So first of all, we have the color. Makes sense, right? You can change the color to be a different color. The funny thing with volumes is that the color is sort of the opposite of what you select. I'm not sure how that works entirely, but if you choose green, it usually results in a pinkish look, which is the complementary color for green. And with blue, it goes to yellow or orange, and you know, similar with all of these colors. So what I usually just do is I leave this thing at, you know, complete white. That makes the most sense for volumetrics anyways, because it's sort of atmospheric details. And then there's these other two sliders, which are density and anisotropy. Now the density is quite simple. This basically regulates how thick the smoke is. And the thicker it is, the more light you're going to need to actually still get a result. So if I take this, you know, 50,000 maybe, you can see that sort of very, very vaguely, you can still see Suzanne here, but usually with volumes, you know, you want to go and make sure that the density is really, really low. Let's just reset our light here to be a more normal strength and take our cube and go with the density. So 0.1 is still really, really thick. You know, this would be a very, very foggy night. Usually I would go for something like a 0.01 or maybe a 0.02. And we create this volumetric effect, right? Now, the other thing that we can do, and that's more obvious if I turn this back up, is the anisotropy. Now, the anisotropy basically controls the density of the volume, at least for our camera, towards any light sources. So if I take this up and I take it all the way there, you can see that the light is no longer really reflecting the atmosphere around our Suzanne here. If we denoise this, it's going to be a little bit more obvious, but it is working a little bit more here. So if I crank up the light again, maybe something like that, you can see that we are getting some volumetric effects around our light source. Now, let me just add in another one in our scene here, make it less strong. Now it's really, really obvious, right? So the light source is catching all of our volumetric effects and it's creating this nice bloom and around here as well. But the other parts of our image still maintain the original look, which is relatively volumeless. I think the anisotropy is usually a good look for a lot of these scenes because this is kind of a natural way for volumes to behave. So on a hazy day, for example, whenever you see light, that's usually what catches sort of these volumetric particles. You need light for them to light up. So it makes sense that the areas around lights are more brightly lit because of the volumes, and the other parts might not necessarily be that. Turning it up to like a 0.9 or something along those values is not a bad thing at all. You can also dial it down a little bit and make the effect a little less drastic, but I like to use like a 0.9 usually. All right, so that's using the cube, right? So we now have a cube which controls the volumetric effect. The cool thing about volumes is that they use the shape of the light that we're using, right? So if we crank this bad boy up a lot and we have a spotlight here, you can see that we get a really nice spotlight effect, basically like a stage light, right? And the cool thing is that a lot of these volumetric effects also work inside of Eevee. I might need to bump up the quality a little bit here. So inside of Eevee, we go to volumes and we increase the quality. There it is. But yeah, these volumetric effects also work inside of Eevee. So that's a really cool feature. Even if you have to work in Eevee because of your, PC hardware, you can still use volumetric effects to create realistic volumetric lighting. All right, so back to cycles here. The other way we can do this, which is a great way if you want controlled volumetrics. So for example, you could take this cube there, you could scale it down, and you could make sure that the spotlight here is getting some volumetrics, but the other part of the image doesn't have to. Right? This way you can control where the volume is. If you don't want that, if you want your entire scene to have volumetric lighting, then the easiest way to do that is actually not using a cube, but instead we're going to do it through shading. So again, like we also went over in the HDRI lesson, we can just change our shader type to world here, and you're going to see that we have this world output node and it has two sockets. It has surface and it has volume. So now we can just take another volume node. It could be any of these. I like to use volume scatter because it's a nice and simple version, and we just plug it in the world output. And again, we can just change the density, we can change the anisotropy, and we get the same effect. But the good thing is that this is now everywhere inside of our scene. So even if we have a large landscape, for example, this still works and it covers basically the entire world without us having to control its boundaries. Now that's how you do volumetric lighting, and you want to make sure you use this only whenever you need it, because it is going to take longer to render. So don't use this for every scene. Make sure it fits the scene, but whenever you're doing like environment stuff, outdoor or even indoor, volumetric lighting can really help sell that realism and create an additional layer of interest for your image to look at. And so that wraps up volumetric lighting, and in the next lesson we'll cover shadow caustics.